In the early 1980s, young women in and around the state of Connecticut were disappearing without a trace. Their families were left in the dark about their loved ones' final moments.
I assumed it was probably related to drugs or something like that. I was not prepared for a serial killer.
After several missing persons were reported, police finally had a lead. Witness descriptions of a man in a car stalking a woman sparked a statewide manhunt.
The detectives start with one case, and then they find another case, and they begin to join the dots.
Police found a car matching that description, belonging to a man named Michael Ross.
The way he appeared, he was tall, very thin. You wouldn't think Michael was capable of this.
Because he was just like the guy next door. Like, he didn't give off that vibe where you would be tentative about maybe getting into a car, befriending him.
Despite his unassuming demeanor, Michael Ross was revealed to be one of Connecticut's most prolific offenders, as gruesome details about his sexual sadism unfolded.
Each time he would continue to rationalize again, and then as the cravings return, his willpower diminishes and the pattern repeats.
Michael Ross had been exposed as one of the world's most evil killers. In June 1984, Connecticut State Police were able to track down 24-year-old Michael Ross, the man responsible for the murder of teenager Wendy Baribeau. However, they would be shocked to discover that she was not his only kill.
He led the police to believe that he was probably the person they were looking for, even before they had a sense that that was the case.
Throughout his crime spree, you could see where there was that escalation, right? He started raping women, and then it did turn into killing them.
Ross was sentenced to death in April 2000, the first man in Connecticut in over 40 years to be given such a punishment. The decision to execute the serial killer sparked controversy, but his victims' families were just relieved to see justice served.
Supporters on one side of the road, the others, they're driving down, it's wrong to kill people, he deserves it. There was just so much give and take on it.
I don't care what they would have done to him. Either execute him or let him live the rest of his life in prison.
Regardless of his fate, Michael Ross's senseless killings would haunt his victims' loved ones forever.
If he would have adjusted his radio and drove by her, she'd be alive. If she turned around because she forgot her purse at her boyfriend's house, she'd still be alive. That is what haunted me from the time I found out it was opportunistic killing.
This killer's story begins on the 26th of July, 1959, in the small town of Brooklyn, Connecticut. Much of what we know about Ross's childhood came from his own accounts. Michael Bruce Ross was the eldest of 4 children and didn't have the smoothest of upbringings.
Ross was brought up on a chicken farm.
He grew up in a home that, whether he realized it or not, the parents weren't getting along.
Ross was raised in a relatively troubled family. His mother had some psychiatric issues, and she left the family to go and be with an old flame. And as a result, his father would find her, bring her back, and psychiatrically hospitalize her.
Even when his mother returned from hospital, the family dynamic failed to improve.
There were concerns that his mother and his father were in some ways, whether intentional or not, emotionally abusive.
She wasn't very affectionate. She didn't really bond very well with Ross.
Mother's in and out of institutions, and I think he was beaten by his parents.
At the age of 8, Ross was made to work on the chicken farm. One of his jobs was to wring the necks of ill and deformed chicks.
There's strong evidence that this environment was impacting on Ross because he started to have some of the signs very young that we would associate with somebody whose mental health is getting problematic.
It sounded like an absolute horrible upbringing. I think his family was so broken.
So it's hardly surprising by the time he gets to the age of 12, he becomes violent himself.
As Ross reached puberty, his behavior took a dark and sinister turn.
Ross started to struggle with sexual deviance at a very early age.
He's caught molesting a young girl. His father responds really badly to this and beats him and then takes him to the doctor, kind of saying there's something wrong with you. The doctor thinks there's something wrong, but he also says, well, this is nothing to worry about, really. He's starting to go through puberty.
Some of that behavior was frowned upon and looked at as deviant by his mother. So his mother would not approve of this behavior, and she would shame him and humiliate him.
I think simply punishing him in a very stern physical fashion was not going to be helpful. That kind of punishment isn't going to erase any kind of unusual sexual urges he's having. And then when seen by a professional to simply say, in effect, there's nothing to worry about, I think also was not the proper way to address this.
Despite this worrying behavior, Ross was able to progress into a model student and graduated high school in 1977. He then set his sights on New York and got accepted into Cornell University to study agricultural science and economics.
If you have that kind of opportunity to go to an Ivy League school and you're that bright, some things that I read that his IQ was like 155 or something. So that's extraordinarily high. Just because he's smart and he can go to college didn't take away, I don't think, the underlying sociopathic behavior that he had displayed throughout his upbringing.
Ross had several relationships with women whilst at university, and although he started off as the perfect student, his grades began to slip as his sexual impulses emerged once again.
It appears that he had a very strong sex drive, wanted to masturbate frequently with girlfriends, wanted to have sex maybe twice a day, and so on. Some of his girlfriends felt that he wanted sex more than they would have liked, not only because of the unusual and qualitatively different nature of his sexual makeup, but also because in addition to that, he had a very high sexual drive.
21-year-old Ross graduated from Cornell in 1981 and immediately found work in his preferred profession.
He graduated and got a job in Lewisburg. He's still trying to fit into the family business of egg manufacturing.
Ross asked his college girlfriend to leave Cornell and move out to North Carolina. However, she wasn't prepared to make the move.
In one case, when they had an argument, she had pushed him and he slapped her. At that point, she said, if you ever do that again, it's over.
In August 1981, his girlfriend says it's all over. That's enough. Ross, probably upset at the destruction of what he hoped might have been some kind of perfect relationship.
Michael Ross's life was spiraling out of control. After the breakup of his own relationship, his parents were soon divorced. Ross's reaction was to lash out.
On September 28th of 1981, Ross went on a road trip to Illinois and he abducted a woman. This is where we start to see Ross really display his hatred and his misogyny towards women. Something had gone wrong in his life, and he decided to take his rage out on a complete stranger.
He not only attacked her, grabbed her, he changed location. He dragged her into a wood.
A neighbor heard the young woman screaming and called the police.
As Ross fled the scene and the police escorted the 16-year-old back home, she spotted his vehicle that was parked on the same street.
She recognizes the vehicle, she recognizes Ross, and he's rapidly arrested. What he was effectively charged with was unlawful restraint, and he's only fined $500.
He's treated incredibly leniently. He is treated as if, boys will be boys. And that lenient sentence would have given him the message that he can get away with this. And at some level, he's not abnormal.
Despite the lesser punishment from the authorities, Ross was fired from his job. Nearly 5 months later, he found work at an egg farm in Croton, Ohio. But this fresh start was soon tainted once again.
Ross spotted another young woman. He stalked her, followed her home, knocked on her door, and beat her repeatedly.
Something must have spooked Ross in the middle of this horrible assault, because he ran off and the woman was able to call the police. The police then located witnesses that had seen a man fitting Ross's description and were able to trace him back to his vehicle.
Ross denied the attack, but of course, he couldn't in the long run. She'd identified him. He stands trial and is indeed given 6 months in jail and a $1,000 fine for the attack.
Ross has what we call maladaptive coping skills, and he takes them to the next level. He's incapable of sitting with his distressing emotions, and so for him, it's logical to go ahead and commit crimes in order to make himself feel better, in order to make that pain and that distress go away.
Ross's life was starting to fall apart as his sexually motivated attacks on young women were seemingly escalating with no signs of slowing down. Over in Connecticut, police also had a lot on their plate when they received a call about a horrifying discovery. In June 1982, near Danielson, Connecticut, 23-year-old Deborah Smith Taylor was driving home with her husband when their car ran out of gas.
A state trooper drove the couple to a gas station in Danielson. While they were there, they got into an argument, and Deborah decided she was going to make her own way home.
The trooper saw Deborah walk across to a bandstand and accept a ride from a young man, but she'd never make it home.
Her husband reported her missing, but the police had no leads on the case.
Over 4 months later, on the 30th of October 1982, Deborah's body was discovered in a wooded area near Brooklyn, Connecticut, an area located close to a family-run chicken farm.
The body is found in a site quite close to where the Ross family used to dump chicken waste, chicken excrement.
Police made their way to the Ross family farm and interviewed Michael Ross's father and brother. They also interviewed other employees on the farm, but no one there knew of Deborah or knew what could have happened to her.
And at that point, Michael Ross is still in jail for the attack in Ohio.
Despite a promising lead, the case soon went cold. It joined a pile of other cold cases, one of which had begun nearly 10 months earlier in the same county.
In January of 1982, a 17-year-old girl by the name of Tammy Williams was leaving her friend's apartment to make the 3-mile walk home. When she never arrived home, her father reported her missing.
Over 140 miles west of where Tammy Williams was last seen, a young high school student in Montgomery, New York, had also seemingly vanished in March 1982.
A girl called Paula Pereira, who was age 16, left school early because she said she wasn't feeling well. She wanted to go see her new boyfriend. Paula's mother reported her missing to the police. Her body wasn't found for a very long time.
Meanwhile, after a reduced 4-month stint in prison for assaulting a woman, 23-year-old Michael Ross's life appeared to be returning to normality. By May of 1983, he'd got a job at an insurance company in Norwich, Connecticut.
Ross's relationship, which had been on and off with a girl throughout this period, one part of him was trying to create a natural life, normal life, and the other part of him knew that he wasn't. He wasn't in any way normal.
He rented an apartment in Jewett City, and he managed to have a girlfriend, but that relationship began to sour pretty quickly.
In November 1983, a young woman who also worked in the Norwich area had left her boyfriend's house to return home. 19-year-old Robin Stavinsky's family were eagerly waiting to hear if she'd be coming to the family home for Thanksgiving.
Robin was my middle sister's stepdaughter. Her and her half-sister moved in when I was in the 2nd or 3rd grade. We grew up in the same neighborhood. We would bike ride, we'd go down to the lake, we'd go out in the boats. There was a constant flow of kids back and forth. Robin functioned more like an older sister. She was 18 months older than me. She would look like just about any college athlete. She was naturally strong, as many of the boys in the neighborhood that tried to cross her found out.
After she left school, Robin had moved in with her boyfriend, but would still come back to visit the family regularly.
I was coming home that Tuesday or Wednesday morning right before Thanksgiving. And my last comment was, everybody coming home for Thanksgiving, you know, have you talked to Robin? Is everybody coming back? And the last thing my sister said to me about that was that she hadn't heard from Robin and the plans weren't set. My sister was concerned that she hadn't responded and that maybe she was in trouble. There was definitely some concern from not hearing from her. It was probably about a week. They lost communication with her. Somebody reported her missing. It could have been my sister or her boyfriend.
On the 23rd of November 1983, 7 days after Robin was reported missing, the Stavinsky family finally got the news that they'd been dreading.
The police called my sister and said, "We think we found Robin."
Robin's body is discovered by a jogger, and she's partially clothed.
They found her in the wooded area. She had been raped and murdered, and they have no clue as to who or why or anything like that. I'm 18 years old. I remember not being able to process it, and I just remember sitting in disbelief for 5 or 10 minutes.
After the Stavinsky family identified Robin's body, detectives were keen to find out who had done this to her.
The first thing they did in this situation was they investigated and talked to her boyfriend, and clearly he didn't do it, right? And so they found that. So, I mean, this thing went cold as ice, like quick. They were working behind the scenes and following up on things, but there was no leads. I mean, there was nothing. There was no media about it. There was no newspaper articles about it. The thing that was the hardest early on was how somebody that was part of your family and you cared about so much could be just kind of wiped off the earth with not a speck of evidence or any kind of suspect.
5 months after the murder of Robin Stavinsky on the 22nd of April 1984, 2 schoolgirls from Griswold, Connecticut were planning a trip to Jewett City. 14-year-olds April Brunet and Leslie Shelley.
Leslie was born December 1st. She was an ordinary teenager. Liked music, was just getting into boys. She was fairly good in school. April was in her first year of high, and Leslie was in her 8th grade. And they used to catch the bus together, and from there, it just became a friendship. Either April was down our house or Leslie was up April's house.
The pair had even pretended to adopt each other as sisters using fake adoption papers. It wasn't uncommon for children at that time to be out on their own.
It was safe. Even Jet City you would think was safe. There was very little crime. There was a lot of kids around. I had gone to work. And as I was driving up the hill, April was coming down to our house. April said that her mother was going to bring them down and pick them up. My husband at the time didn't realize that April's mother had a 3 or 4 month old baby and a 4-year-old son at home. So there was no way she was going to pick them up.
The girls had actually walked the 3-mile journey to Jewett City by themselves, despite what they'd told both of their parents.
When I got home, I went into Leslie's room, and of course she wasn't there. Les never had done anything like that before. Usually when they said they were going to go somewhere and come home at, say, 9 o'clock, they were home at 9 o'clock.
That same evening, both of the girls' parents called the police to report their disappearances. But the police had no leads.
I couldn't imagine what was going on. Every rumor that April's mother and I decided to follow, it proved untrue. We also had a poster around Jewett City that my husband had made up of April and Leslie's picture on it and a reward.
Just like in the case of Robin Stavinsky, the families were left in the dark about what could have happened to Leslie and April. Had the two 14-year-olds simply run away from home, or was something more sinister going on? It would take 2 months for the shocking truth to finally be revealed, in which time even more teens across Connecticut would vanish into thin air. On the 13th of June 1984, less than 2 months after the disappearances of Leslie Shelley and April Brunet, another young woman in the Jewett City area was reported missing.
A 17-year-old girl named Wendy Baribeau left a note indicating that she was going to walk down to the local grocery store. She was last seen around 4:30 in the afternoon walking on Route 12. When she didn't return home, her mother went out looking for her, and at 10:30 in the evening, she reported her missing to the police.
In the meantime, detectives were beginning to look for comparisons in previous missing persons cases across Connecticut, namely Tammy Williams and Deborah Smith Taylor.
These two girls had a lot of similarities. They had a similar build, they both had dark hair, and they were both last seen in Danielson, Connecticut.
There are no obvious fingerprints on the victims. We haven't got some of the tools that we have now. We are talking about 1984, a very long time before CSI or the Behavioral Science Unit or any indeed of the great innovations in tracing serial killers had happened.
That detective was then assigned to the Wendy Baribeau case before he had a chance to look further into it.
After a 2-day search to find Wendy Baribeau, a fireman discovered her body just a quarter of a mile away from her home in Lisbon, Connecticut. Detectives finally had a lead about what may have happened to the 17-year-old.
A witness claimed that he had seen a car parked on the side of the road and a man following Wendy Baribeau. He heard shouting between the two of them and thought nothing of it, assuming that they were just a couple arguing. But the next day, when he saw Wendy Baribeau on the news, he went to the police to give a description of the man and the car he had seen.
They try and track down cars that look alike, and they come up with a list of cars, and they work methodically down it.
After 13 days of gathering witness descriptions, detectives had a profile for the potential killer.
The police are looking for an attacker who is probably white Caucasian.
a 6-foot-tall male with a medium build, clean-shaven and with dark hair.
Probably in his late 20s or early 30s, and drives a particular kind of car.
The detective asked the vehicle licensing department for a list of similar vehicles and their owners that live locally to Wendy in the town of Griswold. On that list was Michael Ross.
The police turn up at the door of Michael Ross. When the first police officer goes to discuss the case with him, Ross is patently not a suspect.
Ross's car didn't entirely match the description given by witnesses, and the composite drawings didn't include glasses, which Ross was wearing. Police were almost convinced this was not their man.
Ross is not a suspect until Ross says to the detective, well, what if the man who was committing these crimes was to say he was insane? Does that mean he would escape the death penalty? And at that point, the detective realizes that Michael Ross is a great deal different from the way he may appear.
When originally interviewed by one of the police officers, he volunteered the fact that he'd had some other charges against him in the past, something at that point they had not yet known about. The police officer had the sense that maybe Mr. Ross was wanting to give him those clues.
Conveniently, Ross was able to give very detailed accounts of his movements on the day that Wendy Baribeau went missing, but couldn't remember what he did before or after that date.
This would have set alarm bells ringing for detectives, and they asked him to go with them to the police headquarters.
When the officer said that for the sake of the victims, if he'd done this, it would be important that he acknowledge it. And at that point, he didn't ask for an attorney. He simply waived his rights and confessed.
The detectives couldn't believe their luck. They had little evidence to suggest that unassuming 24-year-old Michael Ross was behind Wendy's murder.
Here's a man who was confessing to very serious crimes under circumstances where it wasn't clear at that point that there was even much evidence against him that would be incriminating.
Ross seemed to revel in reliving the crimes that he had committed. He also had quite a narcissistic disposition and a large ego, which I suspect was one of the reasons that he was so willing to confess and willing to talk to the police officers about what he had done.
There's a couple of reasons why this might happen. Now, with some serial killers, they're bragging. They just want to say, yeah, this is what I've done. I'm actually quite proud of it. For others, and Ross might fall more into this category, they're almost relieved that they've been caught because the compulsions and the killing is not necessarily easy for them to live with.
Incredibly, Michael Ross was only just getting started. Not only did the 24-year-old admit to the murder of Wendy Baribeau, but he also confessed to killing Tammy Williams, Deborah Smith-Taylor, Robin Stavinsky, and the murder of 14-year-old friends April Brunet and Leslie Shelley.
Leslie and April, they encounter a man who offers them a lift to get home quickly.
Ross had offered to drive April and Leslie to a gas station, but he passed the gas station and kept on driving.
The first thing he does is he takes Leslie, ties her up, and puts her in the trunk of the car. Then he attacks April and forces her into the well of the passenger seat of the car.
After killing April, he took Leslie out of the trunk and strangled her. He put her body back in the trunk and began driving around looking for a place to dispose of their lifeless bodies.
Ross takes them back to Connecticut and dumps them in a culvert.
Ross told detectives where they could find the bodies of the two teens. Investigators then had to break the tragic news to April and Leslie's families.
I was at work and my supervisor came up to the floor and told me that there was a detective downstairs that wanted to talk to me. And that's when I found out about Leslie. It was horrible. It was just terrible. And then I had got home. My husband got home a few minutes later. And then a different detective came down to question us. It was a nightmare. We were so busy with detectives that you didn't really have time to think. You really didn't. I couldn't believe it at first, that somebody in this quiet town could do something like that.
It wasn't just the Shelley and Brunet families that received the devastating news. Robin Stravinsky's loved ones finally found out what had happened to the 19-year-old athlete.
They have a guy. They think he killed other women. Robin's not the only one, and it's going to be on the news tonight. We were elated. They found him. But the elation was short-lived because it was random. If he would have adjusted his radio and drove by her, she'd be alive. If she turned around because she forgot her purse at her boyfriend's house, she'd still be alive. That is what haunted me from the time I found out it was opportunistic killing. There was no reason behind it.
Michael Ross went into detail about how he spotted Robin walking home alone that evening and offered her a lift.
Ross attacks her, and she passes out. But she comes round and she begins to fight.
Ross tried to strangle her, but Robin was a strong woman. She was an athlete at school, and she put up a fight. Unfortunately, Ross eventually overpowered her.
She's dumped, as though she was no more than a piece of garbage.
On the 29th of June 1984, Ross was taken to Norwich Superior Court by police after being charged with Wendy Baribeau's murder and confessing to Robin's. Family members of the victims were at the hearing.
As they marched him in, and he was thin and had that glasses on, and we were just like, you've got to be fucking kidding me. He killed Robin. Like, I think most of us were in disbelief that Robin didn't kick the shit out of him, to be honest with you. She was a tough girl. He must have either got her down or surprised her, because he did not look like a strong guy to me.
After his shocking confessions, detectives were able to charge Ross with not 1, but 6 murders. But there was no time for jubilation. The prosecution had to prepare for one of the biggest murder trials in Connecticut's history. Michael Ross would have to face 2 separate court cases across 2 jurisdictions in Connecticut. The 26-year-old had a plan to avoid the death penalty.
In November 1985, to the murders of Tammy and Deborah in Windham County in Connecticut, Ross pleads no contest and receives a sentence of 120 years.
18 months after his conviction, Ross was back in court charged with 4 murders in the county of New London. For fairness, due to the amount of pre-trial publicity, the case was moved to Bridgeport County, and this time it was the killer's life that was on the line.
In May 1987, Michael Ross stands trial for the murders of Wendy, Robin, and the 2 14-year-olds, Leslie and April.
Ross tried a different ploy for avoiding the death penalty. His defense asked for a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, but the tactic ultimately failed. On the 5th of June 1987, it took the jury just 86 minutes to convict Michael Ross on all counts.
Ross, of course, is serving the 120 years he's already been given. He's now confronting the death penalty.
Connecticut law stated that if a defendant was found guilty of a capital felony, the jury must then decide whether to impose the death penalty. But there was a catch.
If an individual had a psychiatric disorder, that was by statute in Connecticut supposed to mitigate against him getting the death penalty.
The defense team had to rely on the testimonies of behavioral scientists to determine if Michael Ross had a mental disorder. One of those experts was Dr. Fred Berlin, who'd met and analyzed Ross on several occasions.
I had an interview with him in the prison where he'd been incarcerated at that time. My first impression was that if I didn't know about the nature of the crimes that he's committed, there was nothing in seeing him or in interacting with him that would have suggested to me that he was a particularly dangerous individual.
Despite his meek appearance, Ross didn't hold back on the details of his brutal and sadistic crimes.
It was also very clear in looking at that we're likely talking about a serial killer who was acting in ways that included sexual involvements with his victims. And that individual has recurrent, intense cravings in which he is turned on sexually by the suffering, the degradation, the pain, even the death of another human being. I didn't have any doubt that he had the diagnosis of sexual sadism.
The prosecution argued that Ross was a calculating killer who raped and strangled his victims for sexual pleasure.
A lot of the times people have this misconception that strangulation is quick and easy. It's not. Strangulation takes a lot of rage, it takes a lot of force, it takes a lot of personal up-close contact with the victim. And so Ross really was the epitome of a psychopathic serial killer, and had he not been stopped, he would have kept on going. He admitted that himself.
For the families of the victims, seeing their loved one's killer in the flesh brought up a mixture of emotions. Leslie Shelley's father was one of those in attendance.
There was anger, there was sadness, there was all of that. I just remember Mr. Shelley painfully raging. As much pain as we were in, I don't think I've ever seen another man in as much pain. That stood out to me.
On the 6th of July, 1987, the jury found Michael Ross to be deserving of the death penalty. But Ross's defense team appealed to the Supreme Court. And 7 years later, they ruled that a critical error made by the prosecution should overturn his sentence, reducing it to life in prison.
The prosecution was subsequently chastised because they'd held back the fact from the jury initially that even the government's evaluator agreed that he had this kind of mental disorder. And so that's one of the reasons they had to have a second sentencing. Yes, he was having these cravings in the same way a drug addict might have cravings, but could he have been able to control it?
The second sentencing took place in April 2000. After 5 weeks of testimonies and 9 days of deliberations, the jury finally reached their verdict.
The jury decided that they felt he could have controlled it, that he was criminally responsible.
What happens is that jury confirms the death penalty that's been given in Bridgeport County. Ross finds himself on death row.
Robin Stavinsky's uncle Morgan Hills couldn't attend the trial, but was eagerly awaiting the result at home.
I don't think it was relief. I never recall anybody saying that when this guy dies or is executed or convicted, we can kind of start to get back to normal. There was no normal. Normal was being redefined every day from November 23rd on for everybody.
Whilst in prison, Ross revealed in several interviews with a psychologist that his murderous rampage had actually started a lot earlier than originally thought, back in May 1981, during his time at Cornell University.
A Vietnamese-born young woman called Zung Tu. She's 25. She's clever. She's absolutely marvelous, vivacious young woman.
Zun was last seen leaving the campus library, and her body was found in a stream next to a house that Ross was living in. But there wasn't enough evidence to indict him.
In October 2001, Ross pled guilty to the March 1982 murder of Paula Pereira and was sentenced to another 8 to 25 years in prison. Although he confessed to killing Zung Nok Tu during his time at Cornell University, he was never prosecuted for her death. Prison warden Anne Konoya worked as Ross's counselor during his time at the Department of Correction in Connecticut.
My first impression was that he was really arrogant. I don't ever think that Michael Ross felt that he was like the other people on death row. I think he always felt that he was above them. He talked to me a little bit about remorse and hurting families, and I never got that to be a genuine statement from him. I felt like he was trying to manipulate me.
Contrary to his previous appeals, Ross himself expressed his acceptance of the death penalty to the people evaluating him behind bars.
Mr. Ross said that he did not want the families of the victims to go through that and decided not to appeal the death penalty.
His attorneys wanted to say that he wasn't fit to make those decisions, and I don't agree.
On the 13th of May 2005, Michael Ross was executed by lethal injection at the age of 45. He was the last person in Connecticut to receive such a penalty after capital punishment was repealed in 2012.
Michael kept his glasses on and his eyes closed. He never turned to look at any of us. That was the end of it.
After Ross's execution, the Shelley family suffered further heartbreak. For Leslie's father, the loss of his beloved daughter was too great to bear.
It changed my husband. He never really got over it. It was like he was isolating him and myself from his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren. And then in 2010, he committed suicide. He never got over Leslie, and he always blamed himself. He changed so much.
Over the course of 2 years, Ross had murdered at least 7 innocent women and girls. Even when he was behind bars, he claimed that his deviant urges couldn't be contained.
He went on medication because he was afraid that even in prison, he would attack some of the female guards that were in there because of the cravings he was experiencing.
He said that he would likely do the same to me if he had the opportunity. The fact that he thought about it, it was a little unsettling for me.
The execution of Michael Ross had left families with mixed emotions.
There was even victims' families that didn't advocate for the death penalty. But for those who did, that I think it did probably bring some sort of closure to their nightmare that they have to live.
As far as trying to understand Michael, to this day, I don't hate him, but I don't like him neither for taking my daughter away. It's hard.
Robin's loss left a gaping hole in a lot of people, just as you would imagine. She had quite a large family that cared about her, and the loss was felt for many generations. I think he's your classic sexual predator and psychopath, and their body's telling him they have to kill. He has to kill, and Robin walked into his crosshairs.
Ross was a savage and dangerous predator who would stop at nothing to fulfill his twisted carnal urges. He attacked numerous innocent young women and girls, over half of whom would never see the light of day again. The 45-year-old's 2005 execution put an end to a life of sexual deviancy and undoubtedly makes Michael Ross one of the world's most evil killers.